There are some academics whose books are always worth purchasing for their erudition, good judgment, and readability. Dr. Jonathan Brown of Georgetown University is one of them. He never fails to deliver academic excellence. I have devoured his Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World. This is the second edition. The Canonization of Al-Bukhari and Muslim, the formation and function of the Sunni Hadith canon. This is basically his PhD thesis. My personal favourite is Misquoting Muhammad, the challenge and choices of interpreting the Prophet's legacy. And Dr. Brown kindly wrote some words to me on the inside cover. And this work, Muhammad, a very short introduction published by Oxford University Press, is meant for the general public. Very readable little book, very good. Now, his most recent offering is this, Slavery and Islam. And it's by far his most challenging and controversial book. He says he suffered as he wrote it. Quote, "As I worked on this book, the insults and accusations directed at me by others in the academy at times caused me to doubt my credentials as a scholar." It's an extraordinary thing to say. His book opens with this dilemma, which is a key theme of the book. If slavery is a manifest and universal evil, why did no one seem to realize this until relatively recently? And what does that mean about our traditions of moral reasoning or divine guidance? Why do our scriptures condone slavery? And why did our prophets practice it? How can we venerate people and texts, the prophets, founding fathers, a scripture or founding document that considered slavery valid or normal? In Chapter 1, Brown looks at the surprisingly difficult problem of defining exactly what slavery is and whether there is one thing we can call slavery across history. A leading scholar of slavery in Western civilization, Professor David Bryan Davis, observed, "The more we learn about slavery, the more difficult we have defining it." Brown gives us examples of this difficulty from history. Going back in time in his imaginary TARDIS is the Doctor Who's famous time machine, Brown observes the powerful Prime Minister of an expansive empire who enters the throne room surrounded by dozens of armed guards, and we sense the trepidation in the hushed muttering of the audience around us. One voice whispers, "The minister is worth 80 million gold ducats. He's married to the king's daughter," remarks another. "Surely this man was not a slave." The minister was Sekulu Mehmed Pash, the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire in 1578, yet he was also the slave of the Sultan. Brown goes forward in time in his imaginary TARDIS and visits a colder land where he encounters a man labouring in a large shop. He is exhausted by daily work hours that leave him little time to sleep, so Brown agrees to take him with him. But the shop owner catches him leaving and the man is imprisoned. Is the man a slave? Well, he lived in industrial England in 1860. Although the worker was a free man, according to the labour laws in England at that time, a worker who failed to show up for work was guilty of stealing from his employer. He could be tried and sentenced as a criminal, and this often occurred. Brown voyages onwards in his TARDIS to a new land where, passing down the road, he sees a crew of black youths clearing brush all day in the hot sun, their legs shackled and joined by chains. A white man watches over them with a gun in hand. Are these men slaves? Well, this place was rural Arizona in 2004, where the local sheriff was overseeing a chain gang from a juvenile prison. And there's a fascinating bit here about the question of slavery in the United States today. We all think, of course, that slavery has been abolished in America, but actually it hasn't. The critically acclaimed 2016 documentary 13th raised awareness of the fact that the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which formally abolished slavery in 1865, exempted those convicted of crimes from the prohibition on slavery or involuntary servitude. So Brown argues that it's undeniable that at least a portion of America's prison population labour should be categorised as slaves, because they're not exempt from the prohibition on slavery and they're treated like slaves, even today. Chapter 2 of his book looks at how Islamic law and theology conceptualised RIQ, that's R-I-Q-Q, the system of slavery in Shariah. The chapter is headed with this telling quotation: "In the end, among all men who fear God, slaves are part of the family in certain ways." This is a Muslim slave dealer to a French general in colonial Algeria in 1839. Brown explains that the Quran permits marriage between free and slave men and women, and permits the male owner of a female slave to take her as a Shariah, that's a female slave whose master has a sexual relationship with her, i.e. a concubine. See Quran 2:221 and 4:25. Female slaves guilty of a sexual offence receive half the punishment of a free woman, and the Quran tells owners to accept manumission agreements, that's agreements to free slaves, should slaves propose them. This is extraordinary. When I first came across this, this is a passage in the Quran, chapter 24, verse 33, which reads, "Those who are unable to marry should keep chaste until God gives them enough out of his bounty. If any of your slaves wish to pay for their freedom, make a contract with them accordingly, if you know they have good in them, and give them some of the wealth God has given you. Do not force your slave girls into prostitution when they themselves wish to remain honourable in your quest for the short-term gains of this world, although, if they are forced, God will be forgiving and merciful to them." By far the most striking mentions of slavery in the Quran come in the many exhortations to free slaves, either as a good deed done for the sake of God, or as a required expiation for certain sins or crimes. A verse revealed early on in the Prophet's career tells Muslims that they have been given a choice of two paths, and that theirs is the hard path of ascent. It is to free a slave, to feed the hungry, the orphan, one's kin, and strangers. And this is an extraordinary short chapter of the Quran. I just want to read it out from the beginning. "I swear by this city, and you, Prophet, are an inhabitant of this city. I swear by parent and offspring, that we," this is God speaking, "have created man for toil and trial. Does he think that no one will have power over him? I have squandered great wealth," he says. "Does he think no one has seen him? Did we not give him 2 eyes, a tongue, 2 lips, and point out to him the 2 clear ways of good and evil? Yet he has not attempted the steep path. What will explain to you what the steep path is?" So what is this most excellent way? The first thing on the top of the list is this: it is to free a slave. It's verse 13. To free at a time of hunger an orphaned relative, to feed at a time of hunger an orphaned relative, or a poor person in distress, and to be one of those who believe and urge one another to steadfastness and compassion. Those who do this will be on the right-hand side, but those who disbelieve in our revelations will be on the left-hand side, and the fire will close in on them. The Quran also includes slaves among those groups that can receive zakat, and this was widely understood as offering aid to slaves who had mukataba agreements in order to help complete the purchase of their freedom. See Quran 2:177. In Islamic law, a mukataba is a contract of manumission, i.e. freeing a slave, between a master and a slave, according to which a slave is required to pay a certain sum of money during a specific time period in exchange for their freedom. Now, regarding the Hadiths, and of course Brown's PhD is in Hadiths, Brown states, "The Hadith corpus nearly spills over with a plethora of reports exhorting the kind treatment of slaves and describing the tremendous rewards awaiting those who free them. In chapter 4, Brown tackles what he calls the slavery conundrum. He describes it thus: the insistence that 1, slavery is an absolute evil throughout history, and 2, that there are no gradations within slavery that escape this verdict. Since every major religious and philosophical tradition either justified, defended, or at least tolerated some form of slavery until the modern period, this means that the traditions of moral and spiritual authority to which many still adhere were, and are, complicit in gross moral evil. That's the dilemma or conundrum that he sees. Brown notes that although the Quran encourages the manumission, the freeing of slaves and their good treatment, and Muhammad required Muslims to treat their slaves well, neither the Quran nor the Prophet condemns slavery per se or banned it. Muhammad owned a total of 15 slaves, all of whom he eventually freed. That's an important point. He also had 2 concubines, Māriya and Rayhana. And on that point, just to quickly touch on Christianity in his book. Turning to Christianity, in the New Testament, Jesus never condemns slavery and even assumes the master-slave relationship to be an unremarkable reality of life. The apostles included slave owners, and Paul instructed slaves to be submissive to their masters and to obey them as you would Christ. St. Augustine explained and justified slavery as a result of original sin or personal sin. To explain how a seemingly righteous Christian could be the slave of a godless pagan, Augustine drew on the Stoic tradition that, for the pious, the legal and material condition of slavery was meaningless. The only true enslavement was being a slave to one's passions or sins, and the faithful were all free in Christ. Now, in chapters 5 and 6, Dr. Brown examines the Muslim debates over ending slavery, because there's now a universal consensus amongst the ulama in the world that slavery is not to be practiced today, and he evaluates their convincingness. And the final chapter 6 I find particularly interesting, entitled The Prophet and ISIS, Evaluating Muslim Abolition. And Brown asks, do Muslim approaches to abolition pass moral muster? He discusses the ulama's consensus on the abolition of slavery and how Muslim scholars such as Sheikh Mohammed al-Yaqubi have responded to the shocking resurgence of slavery within ISIS-controlled territory. There are 6 appendices to the book, which I won't go through, but they're absolutely fascinating. On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the highest, what do I think this is worth? Well, this is definitely a 10 out of 10. If you want a single book on slavery and Islam that fairly objectively and with scholarly rigour examines the historical evidence, this is the book. In fact, there's a recommendation by Bernard K. Fremont, who's professor of law at Harvard University, who says Jonathan Brown's Slavery and Islam is a prodigiously researched, provocatively argued, learned and multifaceted treatment of a difficult and complex problem. One might not agree with all of Brown's conclusions, but the book would be a must-read for students and scholars of historical and contemporary Islam, as well as for anyone interested in slavery and its relationship to religion. And Sherman A. Jackson, who is the Chair of Islamic Thought and Culture at the University of Southern California, says, this insightful, courageous and comprehensively argued book is bound to constitute a new beginning. It is certain to be as widely debated as it is widely read. We will all be the better for it. So do get this book. It's well written, very readable. Until next time.